In December of 1944, while the Allied forces were advancing toward Germany, the German High Command prepared an offensive on the Western Front. The operation, named Wacht am Rhein, aimed to divide the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and alter the strategic balance in Western Europe. The region chosen for the attack was the mountainous and forested area of the Ardennes, considered by the Allies to be a low-risk sector, defended by divisions with less combat experience. More than 200,000 troops and around 1,000 German tanks were secretly concentrated, taking advantage of the weather conditions to avoid aerial detection. On December 16th, the German forces launched a surprise attack that triggered one of the most intense and costly battles of the Second World War. For weeks, the confrontation altered the course of the Western Front and tested the Allies' response capabilities. What happened in the Battle of the Ardennes and what determined its outcome? The winter of the last opportunity. In December of 1944, while Allied forces advanced through Western Europe, the German High Command was preparing an offensive aimed at reversing the situation on the Western Front. Following the fall of France and the progress of Anglo-American troops through Belgium and the Netherlands, the German defensive line was under constant pressure. Adolf Hitler ordered an operation intended to divide the enemy forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Allies to negotiate. The offensive was named Wacht am Rhein, guarding the Rhine. Its execution depended on a combination of surprise, speed, and weather conditions that would limit Allied air support. The chosen terrain was the forests and mountains of the Ardennes, a region where the Allies had stationed units considered less experienced, under the assumption that it was a low-risk sector. German commanders, including von Rundstedt and Model, expressed reservations about the chances of success for the operation, due to logistical constraints and limited fuel reserves. Despite these concerns, Hitler maintained his plan, confident that a bold strike could change the course of the war. Meanwhile, the Allied forces underestimated the German offensive capability in that sector. Allied intelligence had detected unusual troop movements, but prevailing assessments considered a large-scale offensive unlikely under winter conditions and across such complex terrain as the Ardennes. Allied priorities focused on consolidating lines, planning future attacks, and securing logistical supply through the liberated ports. In the days leading up to the attack, German forces concentrated more than 200,000 troops and around 1,000 tanks and armoured vehicles behind the front line. The deployment was carried out mainly at night and under weather conditions that hindered aerial observation. The units were distributed among three main armies: the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the centre, and the 7th Army in the south. Each had a specific role assigned in the advance. The strategy consisted of rapidly breaching American defences, capturing the crossings of the Our and Amblève rivers, and advancing toward the Meuse. From there, the goal was to reach Antwerp, isolating British and Canadian forces in the north and destabilising the Allied front. The offensive was to be completed in a few days, before the Allies could reorganise or deploy significant reinforcements. Weather conditions played a key role. Fog, low clouds, and frequent snowfalls reduced the effectiveness of Allied aviation, providing a limited window of opportunity. The offensive also depended on capturing enemy supplies, especially fuel, to sustain the advance of armoured units. While German preparations continued, the Allied troops stationed in the Ardennes remained confident in the relative calm of their sector. Many soldiers were preparing for Christmas festivities, settled in towns and outposts that had not experienced intense combat since the summer. The rotation of troops allowed less battle-hardened divisions to be placed in that area, recovering strength after recent campaigns. The night before the attack passed without visible signs for most Allied units in the region. German movements and concentrations, concealed by the shadows of the terrain and limitations in surveillance, remained out of reach of direct observation. Final orders were transmitted to German commanders, preparing the start of an offensive that would test the resilience of Allied forces and alter the course of the Western Front in the weeks to come. The beginning of the attack. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the first artillery detonations shattered the stillness of the Ardennes forests. For over an hour, American positions along 80 kilometers of front came under concentrated fire from more than 1,600 German artillery pieces. The shells struck roads, communication hubs, command posts and logistical zones, disrupting telephone lines and causing significant damage to basic infrastructure. The bombardment was part of a strategy to disorganize defenses before the ground assault. As explosions continued, German vanguard patrols approached the American lines, ready to advance once the artillery fire ceased. Thick fog and low clouds blanketed the battlefield, preventing aerial observation and favoring the Germans' initial troop movements. Minutes after the bombardment ended, German divisions began their advance. Along the line, infantry units supported by armor crossed the shattered positions and attacked outposts. In sectors such as Lossheimergraben, American resistance was quickly overcome, allowing German troops to open corridors inward. Further south in the Schnee-Eifel forest, companies from the 106th U.S. Infantry Division tried to hold their ground, but were encircled after intense combat. The surprise was nearly complete. Most American units deployed in the Ardennes were new or recovering from previous campaigns. Their placement in that sector was based on the Allied perception that the Ardennes posed no immediate threat. This miscalculation left less experienced combat divisions exposed to the full weight of the German offensive. German pressure was particularly intense at key western access points. The plan foresaw armoured columns breaking through initial lines of resistance quickly, securing bridges over the Ahr River and advancing toward major crossings leading to the Meuse. The 6th Panzer Army, under Sepp Dietrich's command, was tasked with leading the northern assault, while the 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army supported the advance in the centre and south, respectively. In the early hours of the attack, communications between American units were fragmented. Bombardments had destroyed underground cables and link posts, making message transmission between forward lines and headquarters difficult. Many local commanders were forced to rely on foot or vehicle messengers, causing critical delays in response. As German infantry secured initial positions, armoured columns began moving. Among them, Kampfgruppe Piper, an elite force selected to penetrate deep into enemy lines, advanced rapidly. Its initial progress depended on narrow roads and forest paths, which slowed the planned pace. Vehicle congestion, muddy terrain, and the need to capture fuel during the advance added logistical obstacles from the outset. At certain points, American resistance delayed the German timetable. In Clairvaux, a small garrison of American tanks and soldiers held the defense for over a day, blocking the key road to Bastogne. This delay forced German units to seek alternative routes, diverting resources and time. A similar situation occurred in Wiltz, where isolated defenders managed to hold their position for hours despite enemy superiority. Meanwhile, behind Allied lines, German commandos disguised in captured uniforms and vehicles carried out sabotage operations. These units, led by Otto Skorzeny, operated under Operation Greif. Their mission included altering traffic signs, spreading false information, and sowing confusion among Allied troops. Though their material impact was limited, they created widespread distrust, forcing Allied authorities to interrogate and verify the identity of officers and soldiers in the rear. By nightfall on the first day, German forces had advanced more than 30 kilometers in some sectors, captured thousands of prisoners, and thrown the Allied command structure into disarray. However, they had not achieved their main operational objectives. The key crossings over the Meuse River remained under Allied control, and resistance in places like Saint-Vith and Clairvaux complicated the opening of direct routes for armoured divisions. The rugged terrain, narrow roads, and adverse weather conditions began to affect the expected pace of advance. Vehicle congestion caused bottlenecks on main routes, leaving columns vulnerable to isolated attacks and making the continuous supply of fuel and ammunition difficult. The expectation of a swift, decisive advance encountered its first logistical limitations in the very terrain chosen to ensure surprise. In the following hours, Allied forces began to reorganize. Reinforcements were mobilized from nearby areas, while higher commands attempted to assess the real extent of the offensive. The first containment orders prioritized the defense of Bastogne and Saint-Vith, recognizing their strategic value as road junctions. The lack of clarity about the total magnitude of the attack complicated decision-making, but the first pockets of resistance began to consolidate. As fighting continued, German artillery resumed intermittent shelling during the night, targeting troop concentrations, supply depots, and communication lines. The psychological pressure on Allied forces increased, compounded by confusion and fragmentation of initial orders. By the end of the first day of the offensive, German forces retained tactical initiative, but were already facing the first signs of organized resistance and operational delays. German commanders had to decide how to redistribute their resources to sustain the momentum of the attack, while Allied forces sought to halt the advance and reorganize a coherent defense. Peiper's advance. Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite force selected to spearhead the penetration of the 6th Panzer Army, began its advance on the morning of December 17, 1944. Under the command of Joachim Peiper, the unit was tasked with quickly breaking through Allied lines, capturing bridges over the Amblève and the Meuse, and securing logistical routes to allow the bulk of the German armoured divisions to move westward. In the early hours, the column advanced from Lanzerath toward Bullingen, encountering scattered resistance from American units surprised by the speed of the attack. After neutralizing forward positions, the Kampfgruppe captured fuel depots in Bullingen, an essential logistical victory given the limited German reserves. The seized fuel allowed for a temporary refueling of the armoured vehicles and the continuation of the march. Meanwhile, the column progressed along narrow, snow-covered roads, facing delays caused by the terrain and vehicle congestion. Traffic jams limited the planned speed of the advance and forced part of the force to take secondary routes. Despite these obstacles, Peiper ordered the pressure to be maintained, aware of the need to reach key crossings before the Allies could reinforce them. On December 17th, the Kampfgruppe reached Malmedy, where one of the most notorious incidents of the offensive occurred. A group of American prisoners of war captured by the unit was executed in a nearby field, a fact that would have significant repercussions on the perception of the German offensive and the morale of Allied troops. News of the massacre spread quickly, raising alarms about the enemy's conduct and hardening defensive stances in nearby sectors. After Malmedy, the column continued its advance towards Stavelot, intending to secure the bridge over the Amblève. However, resistance in Stavelot delayed operations. Elements of US forces destroyed parts of the infrastructure and blocked main routes, forcing Peiper to send detachments in an effort to regain access. Although German troops managed to enter the town, they could not immediately secure the vital crossing and faced counterattacks that jeopardized their control. The difficulty of maintaining a steady fuel supply began to affect the operational capacity of the Kampfgruppe's armored vehicles. The unit's reliance on captured supplies limited its autonomy, requiring continued advancement to sustain its own logistics. The lack of fuel restricted movements and forced the abandonment of several vehicles along the route, gradually reducing the column's combat capacity. As the Kampfgruppe tried to consolidate its position in Stavelot, Allied counterattacks intensified. American units deployed from Wilsam and Spa pressed the flanks, attempting to cut off retreat routes and limit the German forces' options for escape. Efforts to reinforce the advance with support from other German units proved insufficient to reverse the situation. On December 19th, the Kampfgruppe managed to cross part of the Amblève, establishing a bridgehead but could not advance further west. The time lost in the fighting for Stavelot and increasing Allied resistance slowed the initial momentum. Moreover, the destruction of bridges over the Lienne and the Amblève in later sectors prevented any attempt to resume the advance toward the strategic objectives outlined in the original plan. On December 20th, Peiper decided to withdraw his column toward La Gleize, where he attempted to establish a defensive position while awaiting reinforcements or orders from high command. However, the logistical and tactical situation continued to deteriorate. Allied units were progressively closing the encirclement, isolating the Kampfgruppe and subjecting it to constant artillery and armoured attacks. On December 23rd, after evaluating the available options, Peiper ordered the abandonment of La Gleize. The retreat was carried out on foot, leaving behind most vehicles, heavy weapons, and equipment. The Kampfgruppe dispersed into small groups in an effort to reach German lines through the forests, avoiding direct contact with enemy forces. The failure of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance represented a significant blow to the 6th Panzer Army's operational plan. The inability to open a direct route to the Meuse River and the loss of material and human resources limited the chances of achieving the strategic goals of the offensive. The resistance of Bastogne. On December 19, 1944, German forces succeeded in closing the encirclement around Bastogne, a small Belgian town situated at a key road junction. Control of the town was essential for the German advance, as 7 main roads converged there. Capturing Bastogne would secure supply routes and facilitate the movement of armoured divisions westward. For that reason, the German command assigned multiple units to encircle and swiftly take the town. Inside Bastogne, the 101st U.S. Airborne Division, supported by elements of artillery, engineers and other units, established an improvised defense. The division, under the command of General Anthony McAuliffe, had initially been sent as reinforcement to the southern sector of the offensive, but was redirected to Bastogne due to the magnitude of the German attack. Upon arrival, the troops deployed in a defensive perimeter that included forests, hills, and nearby villages. From the outset, the city came under artillery fire and continuous skirmishes. German forces attempted to breach the defensive line, focusing on points such as Neuville and Warden, where roads provided direct access. However, the defending units managed to hold off the initial assaults, using fortified positions and indirect fire support. The weather conditions, with heavy snowfall and low temperatures, made both offensive operations and defensive logistics difficult. Attempts to capture Bastogne through frontal assaults failed to achieve the expected success in the first days. The resistance of American troops, along with the topography of the terrain, forced German forces to attempt a prolonged siege. German artillery increased bombardments on the city, destroying infrastructure, warehouses and buildings used as command posts and field hospitals. As the days passed, conditions inside Bastogne deteriorated. The lack of medical supplies, food and ammunition became a critical concern. The wounded accumulated in improvised treatment areas, often without heating or sufficient medicine. The civilian population, sheltered in basements and damaged buildings, shared the siege's hardships alongside the defending troops. On December 22nd, a German officer approached American lines under a white flag, delivering a formal request for surrender. The message warned of the imminent destruction of the garrison if they did not comply. General McAuliffe's reply was brief, "Nuts!" interpreted by his officers as a firm refusal. The response was relayed to the German officer, who returned without obtaining any concession. This episode reinforced the morale of the troops inside Bastogne, though the material situation remained dire. German attempts to capture Bastogne continued with coordinated attacks on specific sectors of the perimeter. The attacking forces employed heavy artillery, armor, and infantry assaults to try to break the defenses, concentrating efforts on the roads to the north and northeast of the town. However, key positions were maintained thanks to the use of defensive artillery and limited counterattacks that temporarily retook lost strategic points. The lack of air support, for both German and Allied forces, kept the situation at a standstill for several days. Allied aviation was unable to deliver supplies or conduct effective airstrikes due to fog and low clouds. Only on December 23rd, with improved weather conditions, did the first aerial supply drops begin. Transport aircraft dropped crates of ammunition, food and medical supplies by parachute in designated areas within the defensive perimeter. The arrival of these supplies partially eased the garrison's most urgent needs. Even so, accumulated casualties and the constant pressure from German attacks continued to wear down the defensive capabilities. German troops strengthened their positions around Bastogne, trying to completely isolate the town and make any Allied relief attempt more difficult. Meanwhile, in the Allied headquarters, Bastogne's situation was being closely monitored. General Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, planned a maneuver to come to the aid of the besieged city. His objective was to redirect his axis of advance northward and open a corridor to resupply and reinforce the garrison. The pressure to relieve Bastogne increased with each day of the siege, given the strategic risk of losing a key node in the front's communication network. Despite ongoing bombardments, mounting casualties and logistical challenges, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units maintained control of Bastogne during the siege. The initial refusal to surrender became a symbol of resistance, as the troops endured German attacks while awaiting the promised reinforcements. As Christmas approached, conditions in Bastogne remained extreme. Shortages of rations, intense cold and untreated wounds increased the suffering of soldiers and civilians alike. The defensive lines held, but pressure on the northern and northeastern sectors indicated that the Germans were preparing one last attempt to break through before reinforcements arrived. On December 26th, after a week of siege, the first units of the Third Army managed to open a route into Bastogne. The link between the forces inside the city and Patton's columns allowed the delivery of additional supplies and the evacuation of the wounded. Although fighting continued on the outskirts, the breaking of the siege represented a significant relief for the defenders and a critical setback for German plans. The German stalemate. After the first days of advance, German forces began encountering obstacles that limited their offensive capabilities. Between December 20th and 23rd, 1944, the Ardennes offensive showed clear signs of slowing down. The fuel shortage, terrain conditions, and growing Allied resistance directly impacted the continuity of the operation. In the northern sector, Kampfgruppe Peiper remained isolated in La Gleize, having exhausted its maneuvering capacity. Surrounded by US units, Peiper's column lacked sufficient fuel to move its heavy vehicles. Attempts to break the encirclement from the outside failed to free the unit. Ultimately, Peiper ordered the abandonment of heavy equipment and initiated a withdrawal on foot, leaving behind tanks and disabled armoured vehicles. In the centre of the front, German armoured divisions encountered increasing resistance around St. Vith and Houffalize. The destruction of key bridges by US forces and the logistical difficulties of moving vehicle columns through narrow and damaged roads slowed progress. Traffic jams in valleys and at crossings further complicated coordination between various German units. Fuel supply remained a critical issue. From the outset, the offensive had depended on capturing Allied depots along the way to refuel mechanized units. However, the captured stockpiles proved insufficient to meet the operation's needs. Transporting fuel from German rear reserves was hindered by air raids and the collapse of supply routes. Meanwhile, Allied forces began reorganizing their positions and reinforcing threatened sectors. Improved weather conditions allowed air operations to resume. Allied aviation attacked German columns, disrupted logistical convoys, and hindered troop movements. These airstrikes, combined with ground resistance, limited the German ability to advance toward the Meuse. In the south, the German 7th Army troops met with less success than expected. US units managed to contain the German expansion beyond the initial objectives. Allied pressure in this sector prevented Southern forces from contributing to the general advance, reducing flank coverage and exposing vulnerabilities in the German offensive line. German High Command, upon observing the progressive stalemate, attempted to redirect resources to reactivate the main offensive. However, the dispersion of units, loss of cohesion on the ground, and fuel shortages limited available options. Efforts to regroup armoured divisions clashed with logistical realities and local Allied counteroffensives. The accumulation of delays impacted Germany's ability to reach its initial strategic goals. Each passing day without capturing the Meuse River crossings diminished the possibility of effectively splitting British and American forces. The expectation of a rapid advance to Antwerp was fading, while German commanders assessed alternatives to hold achieved positions or withdraw to more defensible lines. Weather conditions, initially favourable to the offensive by limiting Allied air intervention, began to improve, benefiting reconnaissance and aerial attack operations. The appearance of fighters, bombers and tactical support aircraft increased German losses along advance routes and further complicated supply transport. Traffic jams on main roads left vehicles immobilized and exposed to destruction. Airstrikes destroyed trucks, tanks and parked artillery pieces, creating additional obstacles on communication routes. German columns, forced to divert or advance slowly, became vulnerable to ambushes and long-range artillery attacks. As days passed, Allied material and air superiority became increasingly evident. US forces launched local counterattacks to retake strategic towns and seal off corridors used by German units. Coordination among Allied forces enabled reinforcement of key points and isolation of enemy groups in specific sectors of the front. On December 24th, the German High Command acknowledged that the offensive had lost its initial momentum. The possibility of reaching the Meuse and achieving the strategic objectives outlined in the original plan became remote. Decisions began focusing on stabilizing the gained lines and defending the captured positions to avoid a disorganized retreat. Meanwhile, frontline troops faced extreme conditions: food shortages, lack of fuel, and continuous wear-reduced combat capacity. Mechanized units operated with an increasing number of immobilized vehicles, forcing infantry to cover distances on foot and reducing operational mobility. Morale began to deteriorate among German ranks, aware of the mounting difficulties and absence of significant progress. Patton's response. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, began planning a relief maneuver toward Bastogne as soon as he received the first reports about the besieged city's situation. From his headquarters in Luxembourg, Patton understood that keeping Bastogne under Allied control was essential to preventing German forces from consolidating their advance in the center of the Ardennes. On December 22, 1944, while Bastogne remained surrounded, Patton presented a plan to Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower to redirect his army's axis of advance northward. His proposal involved halting offensive operations in other sectors and turning 3 armored divisions toward Bastogne. The maneuver required reorganizing supply lines, establishing new logistical routes, and coordinating movements within very tight deadlines. The formal order to advance toward Bastogne was issued on December 23rd. The selected divisions, including the 4th Armored Division, began their movement under adverse weather conditions. Columns of vehicles traversed icy roads, secondary paths, and routes damaged by previous bombardments. Road congestion and the need to mobilize infantry, artillery, and supplies simultaneously complicated the march. In the following days, Third Army troops encountered German resistance in several intermediate towns. In areas such as Martelange and Chaumont, German units attempted to block the routes to Bastogne with ambushes and defensive positions. However, American armored units managed to overcome the obstacles after intense combat, allowing the main column to maintain its advance. On December 24th, the first elements of the 4th Armored Division approached the outskirts of Bastogne. The German defensive lines around the city had been reinforced to prevent any attempt to break the siege. Allied pressure focused on the Neufchâteau Road, identified as the most viable access route to link up with the forces inside the city. Fighting near Bastogne reached its peak on December 25th. U.S. forces launched coordinated attacks against German positions south of the city, aiming to open an entryway for supply and reinforcement columns. Allied artillery supported the advance by neutralizing enemy batteries and resistance points on the surrounding heights. On December 26th, after intense fighting, the first units of the Third Army managed to establish contact with the lines of the 101st Airborne Division inside Bastogne. The opening of a corridor allowed essential supplies to enter, the evacuation of wounded soldiers, and limited troop rotation. Although the city remained exposed to artillery attacks and sporadic bombings, the German operational siege had been broken. The arrival of the Third Army provided significant relief for the Bastogne garrison, but did not end fighting in the region. German forces continued attempts to regain control of the roads and to isolate the city once again. Battles persisted in peripheral sectors in the days that followed, while Allied forces expanded the corridor and reinforced defenses. Patton's maneuver was recognized for its speed and operational effectiveness. Redirecting an entire army under adverse weather conditions and in a limited time frame involved a complex logistical effort. Coordination between armored divisions, supporting infantry and artillery units allowed them to overcome terrain difficulties and German defensive actions. The breaking of the Bastogne siege had direct strategic consequences for the German offensive. By securing the town, the Allies preserved a critical point in the Western Front's communication network. Furthermore, the German failure to capture Bastogne prevented the consolidation of an effective corridor toward the Meuse River, limiting the offensive's projection in the center of the Ardennes. Following the opening of the corridor, Allied command began preparations for a general counteroffensive. Pressure on the German flanks progressively increased, while Allied divisions regained lost ground and closed gaps in the defensive line. Patton's maneuver not only allowed Bastogne's relief, but also facilitated the transition of Allied forces from a defensive to an offensive posture in the central front sector. The Third Army's intervention in Bastogne became an operational benchmark within the Ardennes campaign. The adaptability, reaction speed, and logistical coordination demonstrated in the maneuver reinforced Allied initiative in the final stage of the battle. The resistance of the Bastogne garrison, combined with the arrival of Patton's reinforcements, helped halt the German offensive momentum and consolidate a key defensive position for the Allies. The Allied recovery. Following the breaking of the siege of Bastogne, Allied command reorganized available forces to initiate a general counteroffensive. Between December 27, 1944, and the early days of January 1945, American and British divisions began progressively reclaiming the ground lost during the German offensive in the Ardennes. The first objective of the recovery was to widen the corridor opened by the Third Army toward Bastogne. General Patton's units advanced north and northeast of the city, securing towns and road junctions previously used by German forces. Fighting continued on the outskirts, but Allied numerical and material superiority allowed positions to be consolidated and control of the area to be expanded. Simultaneously, in the northern sector, forces under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched offensive operations from the Dinant and Namur region. British and American divisions advanced southward, pressing German lines toward Houffalize. The goal was to close the salient created by the German offensive and isolate the enemy units trapped within it. Weather conditions continued to affect operations. Low temperatures, intermittent snowfalls, and muddy terrain hindered vehicle movement and troop logistics. However, partial improvement in the weather allowed the resumption of Allied air attacks. Bombers and fighters helped weaken German lines by destroying vehicle concentrations, ammunition depots, and retreating defensive positions. As Allied columns advanced, they encountered pockets of resistance in strategic towns. In Houffalize, the fighting was intense, as the town was a vital link for German routes eastward. German troops tried to maintain control through improvised defenses, but were ultimately forced to retreat after several days of combat. Coordination among Allied forces enabled a pincer movement that advanced from the north and south toward Houffalize. The meeting of the columns in this town in mid-January marked the effective closure of the German salient. The capture of Houffalize cut off the main retreat routes and forced trapped German units in the west to withdraw through secondary paths under constant fire. In other sectors, Allied forces progressively retook towns such as Saint, Vieth, Noville, and Foy. Each advance required overcoming defenses hastily organized by retreating German forces. Resistance varied depending on the terrain and the capabilities of the enemy units present, but overall the German retreat was continuous in the face of combined pressure from infantry, armor, and airstrikes. The Allied recovery also involved securing bridges, roads, and supply depots previously destroyed or damaged during the German offensive. Engineering teams worked to repair essential infrastructure, allowing logistical lines to be re-established to support the advance and reinforce captured positions. During the counteroffensive, Allied forces captured thousands of German prisoners, many of whom came from disorganized units or were separated from their main commands. German material losses included tanks, transport vehicles, and artillery pieces abandoned along retreat routes or destroyed by air attacks. German command attempted to stabilize a defensive line farther east, but accumulated losses, lack of sufficient reinforcements, and Allied superiority in manpower and equipment limited available tactical options. The German divisions that managed to retreat toward the Our River line did so with reduced numbers and incomplete equipment. By early January of 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes had been completely reversed. Allied lines had reclaimed virtually all the ground occupied by German forces during the initial weeks of the offensive. Strategic initiative returned to the Allies, who began planning new operations on the Western Front. The Allied recovery in the Ardennes boosted troop morale and consolidated coordination between British and American armies. The initial resistance in Bastogne, the Third Army's relief maneuver, and the coordinated counteroffensive demonstrated the Allied ability to respond to a large-scale surprise attack. By the end of the campaign, Allied forces had closed the German salient, restored communication routes, and captured significant quantities of equipment and prisoners. The German offensive, conceived as a decisive blow, not only failed in its strategic objective, but left the German army weakened and with dwindling resources for future defensive operations on the Western Front. The end of the offensive. By mid-January of 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes was exhausted. After weeks of fighting, German forces had failed to achieve their initial strategic objectives. The operation, designed to divide Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and shift the balance on the Western Front, ultimately resulted in a progressive loss of ground in the face of Allied superiority in manpower and equipment. German units began their retreat eastward, falling back to defensive positions beyond the Our River and the German border. The withdrawal occurred under constant pressure from Allied forces, which launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Allied air superiority enabled the identification and harassment of retreating columns, destroying vehicles, depots and troop concentrations along the routes. In sectors such as Saint-Vith and Clairvaux, German forces attempted to establish temporary defensive positions to cover the withdrawal of main units. However, the lack of resources, accumulated casualties and logistical collapse limited the effectiveness of these lines. Most improvised defensive points were overrun by Allied offensives after brief engagements. The rugged terrain and narrow roads complicated the German retreat. Traffic jams on main routes left vehicles abandoned or destroyed by air attacks. The fuel shortage forced the abandonment of heavy equipment, including tanks and artillery pieces, which were later recovered or destroyed by Allied forces. The Allied recovery involved clearing minefields, repairing damaged infrastructure, and reactivating logistical routes as forces advanced. Liberated towns bore visible scars of combat, with destroyed buildings, impassable roads, and communities displaced by the conflict. Casualties during the offensive were significant for both sides. It is estimated that there were over 80,000 German casualties, including dead, wounded and missing, while Allied forces recorded around 75,000 losses. The scale of the casualties reflected the intensity of the battle and the high cost of combat under extreme winter conditions. The failure of the offensive left the German army depleted in both material and manpower. The loss of tanks, vehicles and ammunition weakened its defensive capacity in the months ahead. Divisions retreating into Germany required reorganization and reinforcements that High Command could not quickly provide, due to industrial limitations and pressure on other fronts. For Allied forces, the victory in the Ardennes represented the restoration of strategic initiative on the Western Front. The ability to withstand the initial attack, reorganize defenses, and launch a successful counteroffensive boosted troop morale and confidence in Allied command coordination. The German defeat closed the last major German offensive in the west and allowed for the resumption of preparations to cross the Rhine and enter German territory. The Ardennes offensive also had consequences within the German command structure. Disagreements between Hitler and his generals intensified after the operation, as strategic decisions were increasingly questioned. German leadership faced internal criticism regarding the viability of the plan and the allocation of resources to an offensive that left the army even more vulnerable to subsequent Allied offensives. By the end of January 1945, the front lines had returned to approximately their positions before December 16th. The offensive had failed in its military and political aims, leaving German forces in a defensive position with no prospect of regaining the initiative on the Western Front. The end of the Ardennes offensive marked the beginning of the final phase of the war in Western Europe. After securing the region, Allied forces planned new offensives to cross the Rhine and advance toward the heart of the Third Reich. The German defeat in the Ardennes eliminated the last chance to alter the course of the war through a ground offensive in the west. The battle final assessment. The Ardennes offensive did not achieve the strategic objectives set by the German command. The operation failed to reach Antwerp, did not divide Allied forces, and did not alter the balance of power on the Western Front. The battle marked the last large-scale German offensive on the Western Front and revealed the logistical and resource limitations of the German army in the final phase of the war. Militarily, the battle demonstrated the Allies' capacity to reorganize after a surprise attack and to coordinate an effective response. The defense of Bastogne, the intervention of the Third Army, and subsequent offensives enabled the recovery of lost ground and the re-establishment of Allied lines. According to estimates, German casualties exceeded 80,000, while Allied forces recorded around 75,000 losses. These casualties occurred under severe winter conditions, with sub-zero temperatures and logistical difficulties in a mountainous, forested terrain. The material consequences included the destruction of basic infrastructure in Belgian and Luxembourg towns. Roads, bridges and buildings were damaged or destroyed. The civilian population experienced displacement, loss of housing, and shortages of essential supplies. The offensive delayed Allied plans to advance toward the Rhine, but did not stop ongoing offensive operations. German industry was unable to replace the losses in tanks, vehicles and military equipment. German armoured divisions were left weakened and no longer capable of withstanding future Allied offensives. After the retreat, German forces abandoned large quantities of equipment. More than 500 armoured vehicles, along with cannons and trucks, were destroyed or left behind on retreat routes. Many of these losses occurred because crews disabled the equipment before evacuating to prevent its use by Allied troops. Allied aviation carried out continuous attacks on moving German columns, contributing to increased losses of vehicles and supplies. The German retreat forced a reorganization of divisions along the Rhine line with reduced manpower. Some units were left with less than half their original strength after the battle. The offensive, in addition to exhausting material reserves, compromised the German army's ability to reinforce other fronts. Part of the resources initially allocated to support the Western Front had to be redirected to the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing new offensives. On the civilian front, affected towns faced months of reconstruction after the fighting. The restoration of roads and bridges was prioritized to re-establish basic communication. In many communities, schools, hospitals and homes required urgent repairs. The civilian population continued to suffer from food and fuel shortages in the weeks following the end of the offensive. Some events during the offensive, such as the execution of prisoners of war at Malmedy, became the subject of investigations and trials after the war. Officers and soldiers involved faced prosecution in military courts. These proceedings were part of broader legal actions related to war crimes committed during the conflict. Various locations in the region preserve cemeteries, monuments and museums related to the battle. The areas where fighting took place receive visitors interested in military history. Affected towns maintain memorials and commemorative plaques remembering the events that occurred between December of 1944 and January of 1945. The first monuments were installed just a few years after the end of the war, driven by veterans associations and local authorities. The Ardennes offensive marked the end of Germany's offensive capability on the Western Front. From that moment on, German forces adopted a defensive posture under increasing Allied pressure. The recovery of lost ground allowed the Allies to plan new operations to cross the Rhine and advance into German territory. The battle continues to be studied in military and historical contexts as an example of the conditions, decisions and consequences of an offensive launched under constrained strategic circumstances.